This week, Tod Beardsley from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, is with us to discuss the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog, aka the KEV. Stay tuned for this episode of Below the Surface. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 35, being recorded on Wednesday, July 31st, 2024. Well, we're actually recording what is today, July 19th, to be aired on July 31st. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. This day we're recording, we'll talk about that in a moment, is particularly special, I would say. Quick announcement before we get started. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. You can find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. You can also see our product in action by signing up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. My good friend Tod Beardsley is here with us today. He is the vulnerability analysis and operations team lead from CISA. And I like to say that I pronounce CISA correctly because I've talked with folks from CISA, and it's not CISA, it's CISA. So for all
Correct.
you other podcasters out there, Todd's backing me up on this, right?
Yeah.
It is CISA.
CISA, sometimes a little bit of a Z in there, like CISA.
Sure. Yeah.
But then you run into collisions with the hip hop artist. So
Right.
CISA, unlike pizza.
Right. Todd's worked in information security for a really long time.
Oh my God,
you worked at
thanks.
Rapid7. Yeah. You were at Rapid7 probably the longest stretch in your career, right?
Oh yeah. I was at Rapid7 for 13 or 14 years, which is stupidly long in tech.
That's awesome. The last time we spoke, you were at Rapid7,
right.
and we talked about some of the awesome reports you guys were doing.
Yep.
And you made the move, Todd, to go to work for the U.S. government.
I did.
Let's start there.
I did. I'm a filthy fed now. I would say that. So my work at CISA now I'm all self-conscious about it. My work at CISA help really appeals to me in that I care a lot about software vulnerabilities. That's my whole thing, right? And I work primarily on the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog, or KEV, and the work I do at CISA really, I guess, gives me a personal sense of satisfaction of I get to defend a much larger constituency than I did at Rapid7. Rapid7's great. So is Qualys, so is Tenable, but they all have just a slice of the internet.
Sure.
I'm pretty much on the ball for the whole internet now, which I like a lot because KEV is not. We can get into it in more detail later in the interview, but KEV is used worldwide. It's not just US. So things we do with KEV affects planet Earth, which
That's
I like.
Great. You know what's interesting? I was listening to another podcast, and they were talking about CISA, and they were like, well, what has CISA done? What is the CISA's accomplishments? And I'm like, I think they're pretty great. From my perspective, I'll defend CISA. I'm like, I think they're pretty great. I think there's a lot of room for improvement to do even more and better things, certainly. But maintaining an agency within the U.S. government comes with so much baggage and political red tape that you gotta give a pass there. But given that, CISA has great accomplishments, I would call out the KEV in my mind, maybe number one. I mean, I'm biased because you're my friend and you work on it, right? So
according to the stats I've seen, just traffic stats, KEV seems to be, it's always in the top 10 of most visited websites on CISA.gov. Usually in the neighborhood of top 5, top 4, depending on a particular advisory. Sometimes bumps us out of that slot. But week over week, I would say KEV is the most visible thing that CISA does, and probably the most day-to-day just useful thing that we do.
Right. So when was KEV created, and like why was it? Can you give us some of the history behind it?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So known exploited vulnerability list did not just pop into existence out of thin air, and it has not always been with us. It's relatively new. It is required, in fact, by the Binding Operational Directive 2201. As you can tell, it is my favorite binding operational directive because it's one of two that I know off the top of my head.
There you go.
Binding operational directives are basically agency directives that compel other agencies in the federal civilian executive branch to do things. And so we're not a regulatory agency. CISA does not regulate anything. We're advisory, basically, but for these binding operational directives. And so anyway, Binding Operational Directive 2201, confusingly, was enacted in November of 2021, not 2022, as one might expect. But that's because of how government calendars work. And the government, U.S. government fiscal year starts and ends in October instead of January, for I assume reasons. And you probably are aware of this because we tend to have some budget kerfuffles in Congress every year around September and October, and that's why. So Binding Operational Directive 2201 came into effect in November of 2021, and that thing states that CISA must maintain a list of known vulnerabilities and let other agencies know about them. And so that's where the KEV came from. It was initially populated with about 230, I want to say, vulnerabilities from Go. And those were pulled from the past, at that point, the prior 5 to 7 years or so. And all of those had a due date of getting fixed of 180 days. Everything since then is much shorter due date.
Right. But due date for U.S. federal government agencies to comply with that, to go,
yes,
like,
and only in the executive branch too. So like Library of Congress, they do their own thing. The Supreme Court systems, they do their own thing. It's only executive branch that are compelled to do something with it. Now, only executive branch is still a lot, right? That's hundreds of agencies. You know, like the VA, for example, is a big one for us. Department of Energy is a big one for us. These are all executive branch agencies. So it is quite a bit. But yeah, we definitely, we publish the due dates, and we do it all in public. It's not all like, you know, secret. It's not like classified or anything, or official use only or anything like that. So we put it out in the world, namely because we think, and I think that the last couple of years have validated this list is useful for everyone. I think everyone.
I think, well, and the list represents it at its core, vulnerabilities that are observed being exploited in the wild.
Right. That is,
I mean, that's very high level. There's a lot that we'll dig into that. That's the high level.
That is the main criteria, I'd say, is to get on the KEV, it must have been actually exploited by actual malicious actors, aka criminals and spies, against some target that is at least interesting to the federal civilian executive branch.
Right. I think the burning question that most folks have, Todd, is where the data comes from.
Yeah. This guy right here.
Right. It comes from Todd. And we trust Todd.
Yeah.
Much like, you know, the Linux kernel security person. I forget his first name, right? We trust that person wholeheartedly to make sure the Linux kernel is getting security updates. We trust Todd that he's going to maintain the KEV list.
No. I have a great team. Obviously, it's not just me. And we take inputs from all comers. If you believe you have been exploited and you have some evidence, please let us know. Don't break any confidences, obviously. Kev at CISA.dhs.gov is my tip line. And we read that. But really, I'd say our primary inputs on this are public-private partnerships. So big tech vendors, right? They routinely let people know that their customers have been breached by some way. And then if we can figure out which vulnerability it was, and it has a CVE ID and there's a fix for it, then that will go on the KEV. That's the very short version.
So it has to have a CVE identifier to end up on the KEV.
CVE ID is a requirement for
Which is,
this.
we've got this whole, I just want to hone in on that for a moment,
Sure.
Todd, because what really grinds my gears are vulnerabilities that don't get a CVE moniker. And maybe I'm looking for those more diligently than I was in the past,
and they
but I'm
exist.
noticing stuff that's exploited in the wild that doesn't have a CVE. And here's a great example of why it needs a CVE.
I would say, I'll push back a little bit, because I would say it's weird to have something exploited that doesn't get a CVE ID like within a couple days, right? Like maybe at the time of exploit for sure, because like, O days are going to O day.
Right.
But eventually anything interesting will get a CVE ID, mainly because of the CVE, and I know we're not here to talk about the CVE program, but
sure.
Here, let me change hats. I'm also on the CVE board.
There you go.
And the CVE program has matured quite a bit since 2016 or so. And it's a lot easier to get a CVE ID. You don't have to like wait around for MITRE to act. There's almost 300, I think, CVE numbering authorities. So it's weird to have something escape attention for very long. But anyway, yes, you must have a CVE ID, because we have to have something that we can hang our hat on, that we know what we're talking about
when we're
tracking, when we're saying like, hey, that Nginx buffer overflow, you can't have the next question be which one, right? So
right.
So that's why. And also the CVE database is really handy because it has references. And so you get a description, you get reference. The references are probably the most valuable part of CVE, in my opinion, because it lets defenders know more information about what you're talking about, right? So especially when you're dealing with like exploited vulnerabilities, oftentimes you'll have just like patch links right in there. You're not depending on us to tell you.
That's
where
when the
patch
links
is.
work in the CVE,
and when they're not too old and they've run it away, which is another
now look
issue.
I've heard people complaining about this, and I get it, and I file my complaint as well, but also think about the breadth and scope of the CVE database and how many links there are in there.
I am with you. I've done quite a bit of work actually in this area, and we're getting closer to solving the link route problem. But it is, I'm with you 100%. It is a problem.
Yeah. I ran into that issue recently, and I was like, yeah, well, that's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. We could do better. We could definitely do better. And so anyway,
but with CVE, attached to that, I won't say that it's a direct correlation, because there's a lot at play to get a CVSS score for a particular vulnerability. Was that one of the driving factors? I don't know if that, like, in passing the legislation, that came into account, that a vulnerability will get a CVSS score, and we can't really rely on that for severity or impact for a lot of reasons, because there's so many other factors. Is that what drove the KEV to be published?
I think it was. I would say that the KEV is useful because it zeroes in on really two features of vulnerabilities. Has it been used by bad guys? Is there like proven interest by malicious actors? Because CVSS doesn't account for this. EPSS kind of does. But
we had that
it's
conversation last week.
Right?
Yep.
And so right? So is there criminal or espionage value to this vulnerability proven? And then two, is there a clear remediation? Is there a fix? Is there a patch? Is there something that IT folks can do about it? Because if there's no fix, in some cases that will keep it off the KEV, because the KEV is not about admiring problems. It's about actually empowering people to fix them. Right. And there will be so usually we have a backstop on that of like, if you go to the KEV, you will see the line, please, it's something along the lines of like, please see the vendor provided mitigation or remove the device from the network if that mitigation is not available, right? Like that tends to be the line.
Okay.
And so we can usually go back on that, but there will be cases where there's no fix and removing the thing from the network will kill people. Right, like it's a bit of OT, and
well, I mean, as we saw with the CrowdStrike vulnerability, not vulnerability, but the CrowdStrike event. Thank you. I was trying to find a nice word. No nice words were coming to my brain.
I work in the government.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
But as we see with that event, these things can be very far-reaching and have drastic impact. I mean, this case with CrowdStrike is an unfortunate situation for CrowdStrike, for Microsoft, and for all of the customers using that software. Because I mean, I hope that the conversations we have that surround this event will be productive.
I hope so too, and I hope we're not triggering people in 2 weeks from now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to go back to, but I want to go back to CVSS.
Sure.
When something lands on the KEV, it doesn't have to be a certain score in CVSS.
No, absolutely not. CVSS is not
material. You worked in vulnerability management like I did.
Yes.
And you had the customers that are like, hey, we only fix 8.0 and above.
8.0? Your customers are crazy. It's 7.8, Paul.
7.8. There you go. 7.8, right? And I felt like and I still feel like we're just assigning an arbitrary number to a severity, but what is the impact in my environment? And then of course the conversation is what you should be fixing can't rely on just the severity that was observed and put into a score.
I will say that there was, I wish I knew the CVE off the top of my head, but I do not. There were a set of vulnerabilities involving some network edge gear where the vendor, I want to say it was F5. It was F5, where the vendor put out their CVSS score. They have their own. All vendors do this, right? They have their own CVSS scores. They were all kind of middle to low, kind of boring, but they pointed out specifically, it's and if you take these three together, you get remote code execution. And that's unusual, right? You don't usually see that from a vendor. Usually they will kind of back off and say this is no big deal. This is no big deal. This is a disservice. Vendors don't do this. And so, but when we see a vulnerability used in an attack, that is good enough, right, to get it on the KEV. It doesn't have to,
as long as it's in the chain.
Right.
Well, but that's an interesting thing because I've seen recently.
You'll see post-exploit. You'll see post-exploit privilege escalation bugs. Are all over the KEV. I don't know. I don't know. You've run stats. I haven't. But I would say it'd be in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of those post-exploit things, and probably only 30 to 40%. 30 to 40 is my gut feel of initial access bugs, right? So, and those are going to be your CVSS 9.8s, right? But
this is the problem. We're hitting on a problem that I think we have in our industry today, Todd, and I want to get your take on it, because my take is we don't have a great facility and or process to identify vulnerabilities that can be chained together, even within the same product or target, that in and of themselves are low severity, however you want to rank them, CVSS or otherwise, but together they provide an attacker the means to basically get a remote shell. And I won't name the vendor, but there was one great example. Pre-authentication stored cross-site scripting means I can get code in the web management interface. Someone logs in, that code steals the session, and then the post-authentication command injection shovels the shell back to the attacker.
I've heard this
You need
story.
both of those vulnerabilities to be successful. In and of themselves, it's not, they're not high severity, but together it's bad. Well, how do the KEV is one way that we can, if it's exploited in the wild, but if it's not, how do we track that?
If one or both, so usually when you have those kinds of stories, oftentimes they're real close in time, right? You'll have an advisory and a patch set that's all one, right? And says this address is CVE 12345, 12346, 12347, right? Usually that'll save you bacon, because if the user is applying that patch, they're patching all of them.
They're patching
all at once, right? Now, sometimes if you're very clever, attackers, go do something else right now. I'm going to give I'm going to give some offensive advice. Space your CVEs out a lot. If you can use a 6-month-old and a 3-month-old and a 2-day-old all at once. I mean, you're hard to detect now.
Right. And it's hard for us to track, especially older vulnerabilities and adjustments to them. Is my second kind of gripe with the way we do things now. It's hard to. So
if I haven't patched in the last month, I'm more likely to have not patched in the last 3 months. And if I haven't patched in the last 3 months, I've probably never patched. right? Like that's
Right.
kind of where the fall off is.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that kind of attack gets a lot harder to detect. It gets a lot harder to detect whatever that initial access thing, because it may be something like you say, right? Like a stored cross-site scripting thing that's just like hanging around. You know, you drop that in March and then you pull the other trigger in August. That's harder to detect.
Right.
And
It's,
pin down, right?
and it's hard to have all of these vulnerabilities, which are increasing in number for a number of totally valid reasons,
Yeah.
right? But it's hard to track these reassessment of severity of these vulnerabilities. Kev, I think, is one way that it's a great way to
It's
track
an
that.
escape valve, right? Like it lets
Yes,
you,
yes.
because
If it's being exploited in the wild is the thing, but
if it's anywhere
sure.
in the chain, we'll call it out. We don't. I'm trying to think of any case where we've like waited to find out. It's like, oh, well, what was the initial attack vector? Like, we don't really do that. Like, once we have the
Yeah,
evidence
that can be hard,
on
right?
like the middle part, like we're fine with publishing that middle bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that KEV doesn't do is it tracks vulnerabilities and not patches, right? And so
Right.
we will cover a CVE ID, and the user may, like, we may put 1 or 2 or 5 all from the same patch set, but it doesn't matter. Like, if you patch one of them, you're already patching all of them anyway. And
Right.
so we don't, in other words, we don't like distill it down to a set of patches. We are very interested in the vulnerability, mainly because there are other things you can do other than patch, right? That to mitigate these things, you might have a WAF, you might have like some kind of IPS rule, you might have something else, right? That is very tuned to that particular vulnerability. And I want you to be able to use that tooling that you've spent a bunch of money on.
Right. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting you say that. I actually did see an IoT device because I spent a lot of time in firmware, and I observed an IoT device that was running Bitdefender. And I'm like,
What?
well, that's yeah.
Good for
I haven't
you.
started digging in the configuration to see, like, you know, how great it could be or is configured on the system. But I was like, hat tip. I'm like, I think that's pretty cool.
And you know, like, as storage, CPU, memory all gets cheaper and smaller, right? You can load more stuff on there. Now, is it a failure of technology that we need all of this security junk?
Because it's easier to put something like that
Yeah.
than it is to go update all of the software, because there was also a lot of outdated software on this platform. But like, I get it, but you're right, it's a valid point. So where was I going next?
I don't know, man. I'll talk about KEV all day long. And
I know I was along the lines of like recasting, because I saw another instance recently that I think we put out on our social media of NetScaler appliances. In the original CVE, there was the discrepancy. NVD was 8.8. I think Citrix, or what do they call themselves now, the Cloud Security Agency or something, was 5.5, and it wasn't exploited in the wild. And then it was found to be exploited in the wild. And I'm like, this is great. KEV is great because the CVSS score doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where I was going is, now, how do you, the other notion that I'm struggling with in our industry today, Todd, is the really heavy focus on high CVE, CVSS scoring, remote code execution vulnerabilities, getting all the attention, but the local privilege escalation vulnerabilities not getting enough love. And there's evidence out there that attackers are using the privilege escalation vulnerabilities, even more so in a lot of cases than the remotely exploitable ones.
Well, especially when
and KEV reflects that, right? Because it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. And like, an attacker can use no vuln, right, to get that initial access. They can just ask. They can say like, hey, here's my phishing email. Please click here.
Like,
and then I'm like, cool, now I'm a user, but so I do need something to do something cool, because maybe usually I don't care about that particular user. I care about the organization. And so, and if the organization has things set up, you know, kind of right, at least, that will require some kind of privilege escalation, lateral movement, something along those lines, right? And so that's where those vulnerabilities get to be useful. You know, I do believe that true 0 day, I work at CISA, we're not supposed to say 0 day, because nobody knows what that means, actually. Turns out
right. Well, it's an overloaded term, for sure.
But like, true, like new to everyone vulnerabilities, let's say, are still pretty rare. And I don't think it's just a function of not having the tooling to scan for them. I do think they're pretty rare because this works, right? Because phishing works, because just walking up to the LAN works, as we've seen in the last year, getting a job at the Target works.
Yeah, that's definitely been a thing. Yep.
And so I don't need a vulnerability in those cases to get my initial access. And so I'm with you. We do need, and I don't know how much more we could do. I guess we could just drill it into people to I don't want to cause panic, right? I don't want people. I don't want the advice to be like, well, you have to panic about way more stuff now than you thought you did.
Right. I agree.
And so because that's not great. But I think you solve a lot of this with basic hygiene, right? Of having change control for every system that you know about. And definite change control is important. Don't push out changes without testing them first. I'm not naming any names here today. But also have that security, kill switch, right? Where I can escape my change control cycle, because that cycle might be 60 days, might be 90 days with a bunch of review. You still need to review your security patches, all that, but that has to be happening on an expedited schedule, especially when you're armed with the knowledge that bad guys are attacking this right now. And so if you apply that to your whole stack, well, now you have a process, right? And you have a binder you can pull out, and you can say oh, I see this came up on the KEV. Oh, I see that it's a privilege escalation. It's not initial access. I probably should deal with this soon, right? I can't wait 90 days for this kind of thing. I can't wait to the weekend for, my users to log off. This is that kind of thing where I pull that emergency switch.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a more of a focus on kind of changing your prioritization strategy to give a higher weight to that local privilege escalation, because that's where we see attackers thriving.
In general, right? Yeah. And also, I would also rush to advise don't wait for the KEV, because the KEV is slow, and it's slow on purpose. We are never breaking news. I won't say never. Sometimes we have sometimes we have
quick
cool sources, but we almost never are the first on the scene with a vulnerability, sounding the alarm. Because we rely on public-private partnerships, and we rely on researchers telling us what's up, and we rely on government partners and international partners and all that jazz.
And I'm assuming there's a validation process as
and we
well.
validate.
I mean, you're validating your sources, but even when you get the report, you must be doing some validation
that
as well,
you
right?
have just described my entire job. Well, my entire job on paper. My actual job, I'm a government employee. Come on, I have to have some overhead. But that is the main function of my team, really, is validating a lot of the stuff and making sure oh, is this really an exploit? We'll get reports of saying the bad guy exploited these three vulnerabilities, but did they? I think they just did the second one. And so that's a
good example,
and that's what we really focus on, because for two reasons. One, we want to be sure, and we don't want to just be sure. 1A is because if we're wrong, it's an expensive mistake, and it's expensive for taxpayers, and that's the worst kind of expensive. Right. Because when we put something on the KEV, like we said at the very beginning, that triggers a process in the binding operational directive that says every agency has to look for this thing, they have to patch the thing, and they have to validate that they patch the thing and report it.
Yep.
And that takes time, money, and people. And so anything we put on the KEV, we go way out of our way to say now this. And so this is why we're slow. This is I would say the main reason why we're slow. We could probably be more predictive if we wanted to be, and we could probably be more speculative and say it's probably exploited. But
that's not.
You do that over and over again, you're blowing millions of dollars over a year.
As much as you can talk about this, there was an instance that I observed on the KEV where the OWL security cameras vulnerabilities ended up on the KEV list. I got excited, being an IoT firmware security person. I'm like, well, this is great. We saw this in the wild, but then you said, no, it really wasn't exploited in the wild. And that's going to happen. And I don't fault you, your team, or CISA or anyone, right? That happens. But if I get
It
the
happens.
backstory as much as you can talk about it or willing to.
So there's 1130, I think. I don't know. You probably know better than me. You've got a laptop up. I'm just talking to you.
Yeah, I
There
haven't actually pulled it up, but yeah, that sounds right.
There's 1130 and maybe 32 KEVs today on the catalog. KEV vulnerabilities today. I will take that failure rate of, I believe, 7 that have been added to the KEV and then removed. It's rare to take
7 vulnerabilities, because the OWL one was probably at least of 3 or 3. Was it 3?
Yeah. And so there were 3 on that one. It was 3 or 4 on that one, and then 3 or 4 on another event that was unrelated.
Sure. Okay.
And that was
basically you've got 2 events, right?
Yeah.
You're like, oops.
It was an oopsie. And we apologized profusely. We apologized to the vendor for sure. The vendor, we're like, hey guys, sorry about that. Now, it's not the vendor's fault, obviously. And it's not, it's our fault, but whatever. We moved on, right? It's that kind of thing. It's very similar to me when I look at a software product that has no CVEs. What does that tell me? It tells me no one's looked at it. It doesn't tell me it's bulletproof.
Right.
If you look at the KEV 13 months ago, 14 months ago, there were nothing ever came off the KEV. What does that say? Does that say we're perfect? Or does that say we didn't double check? And so the OWL issue, and then there was another one, I don't remember which one it was. But yeah, both of those, it turned out, well, no, that's not true. The OWL issue was one case, and that was the exploitation evidence turned out to be no good. We were sure at the time. We looked again, but got a lot less sure. Dug it. That investigation took like 3 months or something like that. Often not continuously, but it was like 3 months from beginning to end. Like, are we sure about this? Because this seems weird. Because the whole bug was very proximity based, right?
Yes. It was Wi-Fi and Bluetooth both. I think
it was Wi-Fi and
had
Bluetooth.
To be in proximity.
And it's like, this just doesn't sit right. Like, did anyone see the guy? Like,
right? Yeah, because that's exactly our conversation. Like, wait, if someone would have to be in proximity, right? And so either you observe the evidence and haven't observed the actual person, or both, or neither.
Right? I will say, unrelated to OWL, one of the upsides for me for working in the government is I have much more direct access to subpoena power. So that's nice.
Right.
If I really, really, really need to find something out, I have that avenue. So, hey, hacker kids, consider a job in U.S. government.
Right.
It's a super fun place to work. The other issue we saw, we took another one off because the CVE was no longer valid. And that's kind of a roundabout way to do it, because that's one of the requirements for the KEV is you must have a CVE ID. The CVE ID gets rejected. Usually that means something kind of got screwed up along the way, right?
Yeah, and that doesn't happen very often.
Rare.
Where a CVE gets rejected?
Rare.
It's rare.
And that also took a fair bit of investigation and input from researchers, input from the CVE program, all that, right? So once it popped off of the CVE list, like that triggered action on our side. It's like, well, we no longer have a CVE. It's probably not really a vulnerability. I'm going to go with not really a vulnerability. It doesn't matter if it's exploited or not. I have no way of tracking it now.
Right. Right.
And it was like a year later, and everybody was going to have patched the thing. It's going to patch it anyway. So no harm, no foul.
Is there an age requirement? Like, how far back do you go? Or does it matter? Like, if someone came to a 2004 vulnerability and said, "Hey, I observed this in the wild," is that valid or not?
So KEV is not intended to be like a historical document for all like we don't have the Robert Tappan Morris bug on there, right?
Yeah,
the inciting event that created CERT,
right? Yeah,
it's not on there, and that's from 1988. That is a ridiculous example, but there's like a bunch from like the golden age of worms, right, in the early aughts that aren't on there. Could they pop up again? Absolutely. How many people are running NT4? More than you think, and they're mostly hospitals. So I'll tell you this, if we see something reasonably current, and reasonably current is like 1 to 3 years, and we still have evidence for it, and we can like refer to it, then then that'll go on the KEV for sure. But we don't have an age requirement specifically for that reason, and because we don't want to like paint ourselves into a corner about recency, because like
Yeah.
attackers don't care. Like
No.
if old
It's
stuff
whatever works.
works,
Yep.
if MSO
Yep.
8067 pops off today, like, and it will,
Mm-hmm.
then we will put that on. And MSO 8067 is quite old.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
in the name.
Are there areas where you're looking to enrich the KEV database?
There
And I
are.
think specifically, right, like MITRE ATT&CK kind of comes into play, as well as um,
Yeah.
others,
So
CWE perhaps.
So those super nerds that look at the JSON that makes the
Yeah.
KEV, which we ship, will have noticed there's a new field in there of CWEs array
Mm,
for every KEV. It is currently empty as we're recording, but I bet by the time we're publishing, it's probably populated.
sweet.
So I would bet that by the time this releases, that should be populated with every CWE in there. Now you can derive these CWEs in a lot of ways. Usually it's
Sure.
on the CVE directly. Mostly I want
Right.
to save you a click, right? That's
Yep.
what I want
Yep.
to do. And so like, cause it's a lot handier when you have just the one, source of JSON truth there. So that's one thing that we're working on actively right now. Almost done. Other things are like, I want to have I don't even know how to do it. I want like an asset type tag, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
want to know the difference at a glance of like, well, which ones of these are mobile and which ones of these are like
Mm-hmm.
server software and which one's IoT, stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. We're working out like how to do that. Again, I don't want to have like a prescribed list and then I must pick off that list, because then you get into
Mm-hmm.
like weird situations with blended things and like, do I only get one? Can I have more than one? So that's why I think like a
Yeah.
tagging system is useful. Um, so we're gunning for that. Things like MITRE ATT&CK framework, like when would this show up in the kill chain? Is it
Yep.
initial
Yep.
access? Is it lateral movement? Is it cleanup? Like, I mean, you never know. Is it DOS?
Mm-hmm.
Do I launch this attack so I can launch another attack when you're not looking? Like, I don't know, killing your EDR system. Not that
Yep.
that would happen.
Yeah. I had a question along those lines. Yeah.
um, but so those are the kinds of things we think of. Also, if you have ideas, Paul and listener, let me know. Kev at CISA.dhs.gov, because we always want to know like how we can make the Kev better, more
Mm-hmm.
useful, more actionable for defenders, more observable by like researchers and journalists. Like I'm really interested in that.
Mm.
Anything along those lines, right? If you have ideas, please let me know.
So recently, I read an article about the EDR bypass, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I read a lot of articles like over time.
Sure.
This is definitely a thing that attackers are doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's in their playbook that they're going to run up against this, and they need TTPs to get around EDR. The recent one that I observed, I think, was from Dave's company, Binary Defense,
Mm-hmm.
and it involved using a driver. I don't know if it's so. We talk about drivers, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say vulnerable driver, but
Right.
drivers have specific capabilities
Yes.
that can be abused by attackers to allow them to escalate privileges to then bypass EDR.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily get a CVE, but is there a way that you're thinking about, Todd, to perhaps track some of this behavior?
Well, here's what I'll say is that the KEV is not our only communication mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so KEV is pretty good and it covers a lot, but it does require a vulnerability. It requires it to be exploited and it requires it to be a patch. There are lots of things in the world that don't fit that. And that's where,
Drivers
yeah,
drivers don't have a patch because
generally no.
it has to have that functionality to function and do what it's supposed to do. Yeah.
And so there are cases where like, I don't know, you have a device where by default it's an edge device, but the control panel is also bound to the data plane, right? And so like
Mm-hmm.
I can configure my firewall from the wrong side of the firewall, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's bad. Don't do
Right.
that. I don't think that anyone's ever put a CVE out on that though, right? Of like
Yeah.
having that bridged over on the wrong side. It's a configuration issue purely. But
Yeah.
Paul, ask me what my second favorite bot is. Go
Your
ahead.
favorite what?
My second favorite binding operational directive.
Oh, yeah. What is the second one?
BOD 2302, which is exposing web consoles to the internet.
Oh, yeah. I
Control
think I remember
consoles.
I saw some of this
Yep.
advice floating around
And
from.
so we have
Yeah.
other bonds we can use.
Mm-hmm.
This is a long way of saying we have other bonds we can use.
Yeah.
But we also have authorities on notifications, right? Weird stuff is happening on the internet. You may recall, listener, back on July 19th, CISA put out something. It's in the future for Paul and I, but it's in the past
Yep.
for you on the CrowdStrike event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a bug.
Mm-hmm.
Not certainly not like definitely a bug, not a
Not a
CVE
CVE
vulnerability.
Right.
And so this event will not touch the KEV, but it's a huge event, right? And so we can, and there are things we can do to be helpful there. So we have lots of ways to do this. KEV is but one. It's my favorite. It's the one I work on.
Right. That also got me thinking of what attackers are doing, right, and how they're changing their TTPs, based on the landscape. And my hope is, like, actually, as we get better, it pushes them to different things.
Sure.
I fear that it's going to push them to drivers and things like EFI and firmware to get around protections and other things that may be patched now. Because
like, I get it, Paul, between you and me, listeners, go take a break. I don't get that excited about UFI bugs and boot time bugs, right? Like, I get the value notionally, and I think it's great for spy agencies. But the vast majority of attackers don't really care about like post reinstall access.
Well, because they don't.
A
lot of times they don't have. They don't have to.
They don't have to. They have plenty of targets, and
they have a plenty of attack surface.
Yeah.
Outside of drivers and then bootloaders,
right,
and then UEFI.
Yeah.
Now we have seen attacks in those areas, and to me they're super scary.
They're
for
scary,
a lot of reasons,
and Hollywood hacking in some cases. Like, it's the kind of thing where you would like, it's a plot point. But in the day to day, it's not something I tend to worry about too much. And I know I'm gonna get roasted. I'm gonna get roasted on the socials now. CISA doesn't care about UFI. I'm like, no, that's not that's not that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying Tod gets less excited about those.
Well, because I think it represents an attack surface that we have seen attacks on, just not as many as attack surfaces that live above those layers.
And if that's the only way you get persistence, then it means we've done our job very well, covering everything else. So I look forward to that day.
Right. How should organizations today use CVSS? Because we've got all these scoring and tracking mechanisms, if you will. CVSS, KEV, EPSS, MITRE ATT&CK. How do organizations take all of this now and use it effectively?
Well, let me take your list of standards and propose another standard.
Right? That's right. We need a standard that tells us how to use all the other standards. That's exactly what that's a trend, actually, since the internet was created.
Relevant XKCD link in the show notes, hopefully. I think it's, so I am a big fan of SSVC, which is stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization. Also just happens to be CVSS backwards. And it is it's a very lean decision tree, basically, and all it does is says, is there exploitation or a POC? What is the impact, total or partial? Is the attack automatable? And how much of the target do I have in my environment? And then also something about, like, do people die if this gets attacked or not? And so that's it. It's like 5 points of a decision tree, and that's it. So I like that one, but it's really up to like that. It's up to the stakeholder, right? It's up to like how they need to be able to think about their environment and assess vulnerabilities as it pertains to their environment and their area of responsibility, right? And so SSVC is great for this because it's got stakeholder right in the name, but everything can be, right? But it's very difficult to outsource that to your, cybersecurity software and services company, right? Like, they don't know your environment as good as you do. Now, they can help. They can certainly help get get you to a point where you have a handle on your environment so you can start making those calls. And they can
Mm-hmm.
probably, and there are plenty of managed service providers that say like, hey, you should probably look at this thing over here. And they can help you along that way. But ultimately it comes down to like, who's responsible? How do you actually affect change? What's your change control look like? How do you do it in an emergency? And what is the value of the target if it's destroyed? And what is the value of the target to the attacker, right? Because, you know, crypto mining is still a thing. I don't have to destroy your environment to compromise it. I can run my stuff alongside your stuff and maybe you won't notice.
Well, and the goal is
right.
not to destroy the environment, to use it
It's
for
like
a
biological
specific
viruses,
purpose,
right? Like
right?
biological viruses don't want to kill you. They want to replicate. They
Right.
also sometimes kill you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Like in oops, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we've seen that with, you know, appliances as well, being used as C2 server. They want those things to be up. They know that it's an area of low visibility in general. And therefore they're going to use them for C2 and other things.
And also, yeah. And just to kind of ring that bell, we know that espionage attackers around the world are using more in that consumer grade routers for their C2, for, you know, island hopping, masking, you know, where they're coming from, all of that. So like those devices, I still don't know, Paul, maybe you probably know better than I do. Are pen testers, do pen testers get consumer routers in scope ever?
That's a good, you know, I'm working on a blog post on exactly that area.
I want to be able to attack, you know, I want to attack C-suite, like executive home routers, because everybody works at home at least some of the time. And I want to be able to attack the whole environment's home routers. I don't know how to do that in a pen test, right? Because you have issues of consent. Real issues of consent.
This is the whole area. This is why I work at Eclipsium, right? Is this specific attack surface is most interesting to me, right? Because you've got the firmware and UEFI attack surface, you've got the appliances, like straight up appliances, and then you have like this, some call it enterprise IoT. And from what a lot of pen tester friends I know that work on stuff are like the, now I don't want to name vendors necessarily. Like, I don't want to shame. I'm not in the business of shaming vendors because I don't think it helps anyone. But you know, your IP phones, conference cameras, some kind of like maybe building automation kind of system. So you have IoT is maybe not the correct term. Some of them will be straight up IoT style devices. To me, that means there's a phone app, there's a cloud, and then there's firmware, right? And that you may not check all those boxes, but you've got some of these devices, and oftentimes they're not all that dissimilar from your off the shelf consumer routers when you lift up the hood, because I have on many of these devices, right? And I think, you know,
same chipsets, same software,
same chipset. Yeah, it's ARM, it's MIPS,
it's all BusyBox, right? So
and it's all it's mostly Linux, right? And so this is the shadowy area that I like to play in. That I think it's an untapped attack surface on a large scale, for the reasons we mentioned before, that attackers don't have to always go to that level. But back to the pen tester, I do want to see these things in scope for pen testing, because I want to get ahead of this curve, right? I want the pen testers to go, I use this for like really weird path, right? In this kind of untapped infrastructure, whatever it is, whether it's UEFI, whether it's an appliance from a major corporation, or maybe it's a small device from another major corporation, right? I kind of have those three different buckets that I think have a pretty similar attack surface.
And here's the thing. It's like, if you're a high security conscious enterprise, you know, wouldn't you give your home workforce your router that you control?
Yeah. Yes.
I bet you they don't, though.
Right.
Employers, governments, everybody like cheaps out on this kind of thing, right? It's just like you don't get paid for your commute time, right? And my work expects me to work from home, but doesn't pay for my router or my internet service. So like that's the trade, right? Like you can pen test the home router as long as the company or the agency owns the router.
Right. No, it's a great point.
It's my router, and you don't get to. That's not in. It's very difficult.
It's not
to
in
do
scope.
That. It's very difficult to do that, like legally or ethically. You know. So yeah, I think it's a real problem.
And you could cause a problem with that. Right? I mean, we saw a story a couple of weeks ago, right, where there's a major ISP that I don't know if it was, I forget
There's
whether
software
did we
development
trace it
companies,
back to,
Paul, that
yeah.
where like the attack was, over a Discord messaging system to a developer's home computer that they
Right.
use to push code to production.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you can victim blame all you want. It's
Yep.
like, well, oh, developer, you shouldn't do that, but they do, and everybody does, and victim blaming doesn't get you
Right.
far.
Yeah.
So
But it's a hard problem too.
it's a
Well,
very
it's
hard
hard,
problem.
as you know, it's hard to get them on the Kev because if we look at this one, I will call out a specific vendor because they've had a series of vulnerabilities, and most of them were in end of life devices from D-Link.
Yeah,
I think there might be some D-Link on the Kev, if I'm not
there
mistaken,
sure
and
is.
ones they do support, but they're building up the. I just Wednesday, right, covered an article where there was a vulnerability. It was in an end of life product, and
Mm-hmm.
now Mirai is using this longer list of vulnerabilities to build up the Mirai botnet.
Sure. Yeah,
And it's hard. It's hard when, and you can't expect every manufacturer to support every device till the end of time. It's
no,
just not going to happen. And this
nobody
puts
has
us in
that
a
kind of support
right.
capability, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so, and I don't. Vendors are free to end of life their things as often as they want. Nginx is a great example. They end of life
Yep.
version -1. Like,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, that's not ours anymore,
Right.
and that's the choice, right? And it's great because like they can focus on supporting current version. But we will, and just as an aside, like just because it's end of life doesn't keep it off of the cab. Like we put things on the cab that are
Okay.
end of life for sure. When
I think
we
in D-Link, now that I'm
Yeah,
thinking about it, I think in D-Link you did, and you
yeah,
said like
and if we
basically you've got to
the
the
fix is get rid of
patch,
it. Yep.
yeah, is get rid of it, replace it with something more modern. Yep.
And when we know that, like we can find the end of service announce or something on the, if
Mm-hmm.
we know for sure that it's actually end of service, that will be the advice is not couched in get a fix or get rid of it. Like we get rid of the get a fix part. Like we say get rid
Yeah.
of it. And so that's pretty clear. We have a few like that.
Right. Really quick, tell us about Vulnrichment.
Vuln
Give people a
Richmond,
taste. Yeah,
it's
give people
awesome.
a taste, a teaser.
So Vulnrichment is effectively a backstopping program that CISA launched a couple months back, I would say, where we are aiming to fill in the gaps on CVE records that are missing kind of key data, right? So that would
Mm-hmm.
be CWE IDs, common weakness enumeration IDs,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, CVSS scores, which we've talked about at length, uh,
Mm-hmm.
valuable or not.
Right.
The
Right.
string is still pretty valuable regardless of the score. Like it matters a lot to
No, I
me
agree.
if it's a
Yep.
like a network,
Mm-hmm.
network access, no privs, things like that. So CWE, CVSS, and most challengingly, CPE strings. We're
Mm-hmm.
working on that. Stay tuned. And then also we're decorating these CVE entries all with three of our decision points from SSVC, which I talked about a little bit, our
Mm-hmm.
stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization. And that's have we seen an exploit? Is the thing is the attack automatable, and what's the impact of the
Mm-hmm.
attack, right? And so we decorate all of those. And going forward, you should expect that at least that SSVC block
Mm-hmm.
and a KEV flag, is it on the KEV or not,
Mm-hmm.
will be published with every CVE going forward.
Going forward, yeah,
Right.
that was the right next
I'm not
question. Yeah,
I'm not going to go back to
you're not going to go back on it.
1999.
Yep.
But going forward we can, and maybe if we get super duper good at it, we can start doing
Back
prior
catalog.
years and
Yeah.
everything.
Mm-hmm.
But going forward, that's the goal, right? And so
Yep.
I think we're in range of probably by September-ish, probably we'll be all caught up with 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And then we should be able to hit like the CVEs as they come. And best of all, you don't have to go anywhere special.
Mm-hmm.
We started it with a GitHub repo, and you could go look on GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're republishing back into the CVE database, so you don't have to do
Mm-hmm.
anything exciting. You have it already. If you already have CVEs, you're already soaking in Vulnrichment.
I gotcha. Okay. That's
So
good to know. That was the piece I was missing. Yeah,
yep.
that's awesome. Yeah.
The GitHub will remain. The GitHub repo will remain hopefully forever.
Mm-hmm.
because I really like it as a source of talking to users, as a source of gathering issues, a source of fixing bugs, right? Like, I think that's what GitHub's actual like secret
really
superpower
good.
is.
I agree.
Is the issue management. And so if you see something weird in, you know, our enrichment of a vulnerability, you can tell us and we can respond to it.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, Todd, we're short on time today,
Yeah.
and it's been an interesting day for sure. I know by the time people listen to this, there'll be a lot of fallout, but
yeah,
enjoyed the conversation very much, Todd. That was
Same.
amazing information.
You gonna be in Vegas?
And the email address one more time for people that want to send you feedback, or you notice something is being exploited in the wild.
Let me tell you the email address, and then you're going to answer if you're going to be in Vegas or not. It is KEV, KEV at CISA.dhs.gov.
I will not be in Vegas, but hopefully when you come here to Rhode Island, we'll get to hang out.
I will be in Rhode Island in August. So
sweet. Thanks so much, Todd.
Thanks.
That will conclude this episode of Below the Surface. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.